This is Chapter 2 of the Openstax textbook, which covers the basics of psychological research. And I'm just going to warn you, this is a very long PowerPoint presentation, and it covers a lot of details, and so I'm going to try to get through it without boring myself or the listener. We'll see if that is possible. Okay. One of the questions that was actually asked of me on my I think it was my APA, what's it called? Advanced placement. My AP writing class in high school was whether or not watching television increased violence in children. So apparently that's still a popular topic some 30 years later. Oh, not 30 years, more like 25. Why is research important? If we rewind about 300 years, we still have, or even 2,500 years, we still have claims that could be called psychological. But only in the last 130, 150 years do we have a body of empirical research to support the claims about psychology. So it's one thing to imagine that, say, the size of your brain improves intelligence. You can kind of just like sit on a couch, talking with your friends, and decide, yeah, I think the bigger the brain, the smarter the person, which isn't far from some of the assumptions in the 18th and 19th centuries. But to actually have evidence that that's a case, that is the case, is an entirely different thing. So research, at least in psychology, and at least in the West, in the Western so-called developed world, research is the practice of collecting data in a systematic way to test hypotheses or assumptions about the way that reality is, or the way that psychological reality is. Since about the 1920s, psychology has been dedicated, by and large, has been dedicated to the scientific method of experimentation. So in order for it to proceed as an experimental science, research has to be conducted in a systematic way so that claims about psychology are tested to see if they stand. And if they do not stand to experimentation, then they're discarded. This here is a picture of a skull of a person who had what's called trepanation, which is where they drill a hole in the forehead to release possibly spirits from the body. It was practiced for a very long time. We don't do that anymore because there's no evidence that it helps, and it's based on faulty assumptions. So why is research important? So we don't keep torturing people and calling it psychological help. Throughout this book, you will be exposed to, and throughout psychology in general, you'll be exposed to a lot of claims about human behavior, about the mind, about development, and so on. And ideally, you learn how to critically evaluate those claims. To not critically evaluate would be to take everything at face value and to just trust without second guessing every bit of information that you're given. So ideally, you don't just trust whenever you read a story on Facebook or Instagram or watch a video on TikTok. You think, okay, this is a person who's making this claim. They have motivations for doing so, and you consider all of that. And then if you study advanced psychological methods, you might be able to evaluate the quality of that claim by looking at the evidence and so on. The process of scientific research can go one of two ways. The deductive way, so that's here at the top, deductive reasoning, begins with an established premise, so something that's already known about humans, such as the fact that all humans will die. So that's a law. No one, with the exception of a few figures in the Old Testament, in the Christian Bible, nobody is immortal. And all people will die, and so we can deduce from that death is going to be a part of my life and your life, even though it hasn't happened yet. So we can start from a general law and then work down from that. Inductive reasoning works the other way. We have individual cases like my experience and your experience and like the experience of 38 others. And if we can find a general tendency across all 40 people, we might be able to make a claim that it applies to everyone. And so inductive reasoning starts with particular examples and then works towards an overarching law or a general claim. With the experimental method, we can only use inductive reasoning, usually supported by deductive logic. So it's a combination of both. In the scientific method, we see another cycle. Generally, it starts off with a theory, or with a hypothesis. So this would be an assumption about the way that psychological nature is, but that hypothesis usually is grounded in a theory, so we have to go back before the hypothesis to a theory, and the theory was established because of previous research, so we have to go back. So there really is no beginning or end to the cycle, but if you were going to conduct an experiment or do some research, you would start off with a hypothesis rooted in a theory. You would organize a study to test your hypothesis, and then you would analyze the data that you had collected, and then you would use that data to either support or reject your hypothesis, which would add to the existing literature and the theory. And if you do that a couple more 100 times, maybe you would establish your own theory. Looking at the way that research has been practiced, in the first chapter, you were introduced to a bunch of different psychological theories. Well, one of those is Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. And for example, his structure of the personality, superego, ego, and id. Most of the concepts of Freud, such as repression and defense mechanisms, and the structure of the personality and development, can't really be falsified. So his theories, his hypotheses can't be tested. A lot of work has been done by psychoanalysts in the 20th century and even continuing today. I know the New School for Social Research is like committed to this, committed to researching in as scientific a way the claims of Freud and the claims of psychoanalysis and like the neo-Freudians and psychotherapists that kind of followed him. But many experimental psychologists reject Freud out of it immediately because of his non-falsifiable theories. Here is a couple of non-experimental methods. A case study, naturalistic observation, surveys, archival research. Let me just make sure. Okay, yeah, there's going to be slides for each of these, so I won't describe them all in advance. A case study looks at one individual, one unique case, usually of something rare. If it was less rare, we could look at more cases and compare them. But if it's something that happens very unusually or very occasionally, or something that you would never want to make happen to a subject, a research subject, a case study is a great example. So what you can do in a case study is examine all of the details of this particular case and try to understand, by using the specific case, what we can learn about the phenomenon in general. So in this picture here, it looks like there was someone who had been psychologically abused and isolated. We would never want to subject a child to that, but here's a child who was subjected to that by their parents, criminally, no doubt. And if we want to know the long-term effects of that, we can follow this child and really analyze how she maybe reacts to building relationships or trusting others, feeling safe, and so on. A case study isn't easily generalizable because we don't know what variables are responsible for, in this case, her emotional awareness and so on, but we can compare maybe her to people who haven't been isolated or severely psychologically abused, Oh, it looks like she may have actually been physically abused too. So a horrible situation. But if we want to study the impact of that on kids and don't want to subject kids to that, we can really analyze as carefully as possible, as detailed a way as possible, what the effects of that were on her. I have conducted a few case studies, and it allows me to go way into depth about one person in the context of whatever it is I'm studying. The next one is naturalistic observation. Um, I guess these are kind of combined here. That's when we don't create artificial conditions to study a topic. So if I'm interested in studying, say, kindergarteners' social behavior, I wouldn't invite a bunch of what 5-year-olds into my office and watch them interact, because that would be an unnatural setting. I would have to go to their kindergarten and watch them interact together, and that way I can see it in their natural setting. So we see this other Jane Goodall did this with primates, and so she didn't study primates in the zoo, which is an artificial setting. She actually went out to where they live and watched them interact with each other. I think there were some pluses and minuses, and the formatting of this got all messed up for some reason. The idea behind naturalistic observation is that we're not manipulating the environment at all, so we can trust, I don't know how accurate that is, but we can trust that the behaviors we're observing are normal. If we invited them into kids into my office, I'm sure they would be awkward and uncomfortable at first, and then I would conclude kindergartners are awkward and uncomfortable, but that would just be an artifact of me inviting them to an unnatural setting. Another way of collecting data is to conduct surveys or questionnaires. A lot of my college students like to collect data this way, so they can just make a survey using Google Forms and then send it to everyone on their Instagram list or a GroupMe account, and then everyone can just take it, and then they have results immediately, which are almost kind of semi-analyzed by Google. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way, like I did when I was in college. You can write up a paper and pencil quiz where people have to like circle their options, and then you have to go through and add them all up by hand. But surveys can get a lot of data from a large number of people, which you can analyze using maybe a correlational method. Archival research is what most people refer to when they say, I'm writing a research paper. You go to the computer, you go to the library, you go to the archives, and look at existing data, you look at existing research, existing writing, and then try to analyze and synthesize all that information into a new conclusion, or to make an argument. I've done a lot of archival research as well, more common in history. Longitudinal and cross-sectional research are methods of testing change in people over time. So developmental psychologists like to use these methods. Cross-sectional research looks at, let's say, people in their 10s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. So they interview people in each of those groups right now. Longitudinal research might be interested in the same age groups, but instead chooses to follow 10-year-olds as they become 20-year-olds and then become 30-year-olds. So that would take 30 years to go from 10 to 40, whereas cross-sectional research we can do right now. The problem with cross-sectional research is that we don't know if the differences between 10-year-olds and 40-year-olds are age-related or cohort-related. 10-year-olds that today grew up with smartphones. A lot of them were parented by iPads. Whereas 40-year-olds didn't have iPads until they were in their 20s, mid-20s probably. And so we can't tell if differences are due to technology or social media or age. And so we can't test that in cross-sectional research. With longitudinal research, well, there's nothing to predict whether or not someone who starts a study at 10 will finish when they're 40. Maybe they'll move, get out of contact, or pass away, or lose interest. Correlational research is when you look at two different variables and just test their relationship. So here we've got the relationship between height and weight. fatigue and sleep, and then shoe size and sleep. Um, Correlations can be 0, so there's no correlation between these variables. They can be negative, which means as the one variable goes up, the other variable goes down, or they can be positive, whereas one variable goes down, the other goes down, or if one goes up, the other goes up. By the way, correlational data cannot tell us why there's a relationship. It can only point out the relationship, but that's a topic for a more advanced course, I suspect. Oh, there it is. Correlation does not indicate causation. Take a careful look at this slide. And if you can understand this detail, you'll be ahead of most people who fancy themselves methodologists. This is a picture of, what are those called? This was a cereal they had when I was a child. I don't know if they still make it, but they're little cookies. That can't be healthy. Okay. Okay. Illusory correlations. I wonder what the data is behind that, or what a good example of an illusory correlation would be. So that's when it seems like there's a relationship between two things, when in reality no such relationship exists. Maybe it's when you assume there to be a relationship, but if you were to actually test it, there wouldn't be. Such as the assumption, I love this one, the assumption that working a part-time job in high school increases high schoolers' sense of responsibility or financial awareness, when in fact, if you collect the data, the opposite is the case. So people who work part-time jobs in high school practice less responsibility and are less financially smart, or have less financial literacy, which isn't what you'd expect. Confirmation bias is when you look at data and kind of throw out the data that doesn't support your hypothesis, and then over-interpret data that does support your hypothesis. So this doesn't happen consciously. We tend to devalue information that is inconsistent with our values, and we overvalue information that is consistent with our values. The only way to test cause and effect is to conduct an experiment, and in an experiment, you have to control all variables that you're not testing, and that requires a lot of planning and a lot of care. So here we've got the experimental group is the group that has the experimental condition. It has whatever it is the hypothesis you're trying to test. And then your control group is there to make sure that the variable you're trying to test is actually making the change, and not time or some random other event. So for example, if I wanted to test the effects of a new headache medication, I might find 80 participants who are reporting a headache, and I'll give half of them my medication, and I'll give the other half some pill that looks like my medication but isn't actually my medication. And then I would compare both groups. The group that gets the medication would be the experimental group. The group that gets something that looks like medication but actually isn't, so maybe it's a Tic Tac or like a little sugar pill, they would be the control group. If I find out that the participants who got the drug had a headache longer than the control group, then my pill actually was harmful. If people in the experimental group get better, but the control group gets better just as much, then my drug is ineffective. It does nothing. But if the participants who take the drug get better more than the control group who get something that looks like my drug, then I can conclude that my drug actually was responsible. It's a lot of data to collect. It's a lot of variables to control, and most people lack the patience of seeing something like that through, seeing a study like that through. What you would be testing in that example, if you gave someone a sugar pill and told them it would help make their headaches go away, some of some of the participants would actually experience their headache going away, even though you didn't give them a drug. In some cases, their headache just would have gone away naturally. And so that's one effect of a control group. So you can kind of control for that. But then some people would just get better because they think they would get better. And that's called the placebo effect, which is really a really interesting phenomenon in medical research and then in psychological treatment research. I'm not going to go into single blind and double blind studies because when I learned those terms as a psychology student, I just kind of memorized them and didn't really appreciate them. It's in some, it's a way of hiding who's getting the treatment from who's not getting the treatment. Because if I knew that these 40 participants were getting my treatment, I might like be really interested in them. Like, here you go, good luck. Because I want my treatment to work. And then the other group might be like, here you go. I had to do this because it's part of the design, but I don't really care about you. Well, maybe my interaction with them would influence the results of the study. So that would be, that's a way of blinding the study. If the participants don't know and the person who's giving the treatment doesn't know, that's double blind. If only the participants don't know, that's single blind. So I defined it anyway. In any research, correlation or otherwise, actually not in correlation, you might assume you know the difference between the variables in correlation, but you can't. In an experiment, you have two types of variables. The independent variable is the one you're testing. You want to see if this has an influence on some other variable. The influenced variable is the dependent variable. The good way to think about that is which variable on its own or which variable is looked at on its own, and that is the independent variable. So that would be the headache medication. The dependent variable is what the independent variable is changing, and so that would be whether or not the headache goes away or someone's headache level. And so the independent variable, the drug, is designed to, when being tested, it's designed to make the headache go away or change the headache level, which is the dependent variable. So independent variable acts on the dependent variable. The dependent variable is what you measure in an experiment. How am I doing on 24 hours? So we got 10 slides left, and I don't have like a running log of how long this has been. When you're conducting research, the people who are involved in your study are called participants or research subjects. If I'm studying the effects of teaching styles on college students, I might be looking at college professors as my population of interest, or college students as my population of interest. But just in like my university, we've got 200 some professors and then 6,500 students. I can't test all of them. More so if I'm looking at all professors in the nation and all students in the nation. So we're talking about millions and tens of millions. So what you have to do instead of looking at the entire population is select a sample that ideally represents the population. And so there are methods of collecting participants that ensures or helps support their representation of the population. The best way to do that is random sampling so that everyone has an equal likelihood of participating. If you don't use random sampling, then what you might be finding is the people who end up participating have something unique about them that makes them participate. So maybe they're more conscientious, maybe they're more worried about their grades, maybe they're more excited and creative about trying something new. And then what you've already done is like artificially divided the population in a way that you weren't trying to test. So a random sample is the best way to do that. But you can also, there are other methods of sampling that are non-random, but that can still be somewhat representative. But random is the golden standard. Once you get your participants, once you have your sample, if I had 80 students and I was testing a headache medication, I couldn't just give the first 40 who came the medication, then the last 40 who came the placebo. I would need to everyone would need to have an equal likelihood of receiving the independent variable, or receiving or being in the experimental group. And the best way to do that is to use random assignment. Otherwise, again, we're artificially introducing a variable that might influence our dependent variable. So it's a extraneous or confounding variable. So random assignment can help us prevent that. Okay, let's say I'm doing headache medication again. If I was testing, like if it was cluster headaches or migraines, which are really debilitating headaches, and I was designing a study to test whether or not my drug worked, of course it would be good to give headache sufferers something that I think will make them better. But would it be ethical to give a headache sufferer a fake pill that I did not believe would make them better? It's the only way to test my hypothesis that the medication will be helpful. However, wouldn't it be unethical to say, here, this will help, but really it won't? Like that would be, there would be an ethical component there. And so every school has an institutional review board, or every research consortium has an institutional review board that checks the ethical violations against the value of the research. And I think in that case, an ordinary headache would be fine to give someone a drug that doesn't work. But this happens in medicine all the time. So there's a new treatment for a serious condition, maybe it's a fatal condition, and we don't know whether or not the treatment is going to work, but we think it will. Is it okay to give people fake treatments and tell them that we think it'll help them? So that's why you have to consider the ethical components of research when you're manipulating variables, and that's what you're doing here. If you gave everyone the active medicine, you wouldn't know if their improvement could be attributed to the medicine or the placebo effect or some other reason, but there wouldn't be any ethical component there. We are giving people something that we think will help them, that medically we think will help them. So it's a trade-off. For the most part, when you collect experimental data, the analysis is statistical. So in psychology, you don't talk about like the experience of depression. Generally, when it's studied experimentally, we have some sort of depression measure. So it might be a score on a depression scale. So when you give someone an antidepressant, you want to see whether or not their score on the depression inventory goes down, stays the same, or goes up. Goes down would be ideal. But what does it mean to say that my depression decreased by 50%? Human experience isn't proportional that way. Like we don't have, oh, today I feel 12% happier than I did yesterday. We just know that we feel happier, or we feel more lethargic. That being said, most experimentation comes down to statistical analyses, and in statistical analyses we have things like probability of success, likelihood of error, interpretive error, and so on. If you've conducted research, and now we're talking about where you would be in 10 years' time if you're a first-year undergraduate student, you can present your research to a professional society at a conference, for example, or you can present it to your university. You can try to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, which is when you submit your research report and it gets evaluated by 2 to 5 others, well, 1 to 3 in my experience, others who check the quality of the work that was done, check your conclusions and your results, discussion, and then make sure it fits like the community you're publishing it in. That's what peer review does. It's kind of like it's gone through a system of checks to make sure that once it gets published, it's representative of what the research or the scientific community counts as valuable. Looks like replication. So a replicated study is when you replicate an existing research article or an existing experiment to see if you find the results again. So that's not an original research project, but it's still an important part of the process. A part that I think is exceedingly rare. You don't come across replicated studies, or at least not in the research that I review. Maybe it's more common in highly specialized areas of experimentation. Bad science and retraction. If there's a methodological problem or an analysis error, it's not uncommon to have a journal article print a retraction. So maybe something gets published, and it's published, it's out there. And then in a subsequent issue, they may retract some of the results or retract, maybe it's like sending a warning or a caution about interpreting the previous study. And they've got a specific example here of the relationship between childhood vaccines and autism. My guess is those were correlational studies that drew causal conclusions, and they published causal conclusions when in fact the data didn't suggest that, or there was a data collection error that was later found. Yeah, unfortunately, once that bell rings, it's hard to unring it, as they say in law. How are we doing? All right, 4 more slides. Hang in there with me. These are principles of research quality. So reliability and validity. Reliability is simply the degree to which results would happen again identically to the first. So if I collected data today, I would have the same kind of results tomorrow and Wednesday. Oh, I'm sorry, today is, you don't know what today is. I'd have the same results tomorrow and the next day and the next day. If 6 people all collected depression data from a classroom of students, that all 6 people get the same kind of answer. So that would mean that our results are reliable. They're consistent. They were replicated or reproduced. Inter-rater reliability, same kind of thing. If each person conducted a depression inventory on one individual and they all got the same result, and that would tell us that the inter-rater reliability was high. But if 2 people found, like, Sharon had a depression score of 37, and then the third person found that Sharon had a depression score of 10, then we would have to wonder about the third depression inventory, this third rater. What were they doing? Do we need to throw their rating out or find someone else to see if we can increase that inter-rater reliability? Validity, on the other hand, looks at whether or not the depression inventory actually measures depression. If all we were measuring was Sharon's hair length, I don't think anyone would predict that hair length has anything to do with depression. We could produce highly reliable results. We all use the same kind of metric ruler. We all get approximately identical results, but the hair length measurement doesn't say anything about the depression. Therefore, it's completely invalid. I've already talked about the institutional review board when you get back to the ethics of manipulating variables, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Informed consent simply means that you're letting participants know that they're being involved in an experiment or a study, and anything that they need to know about that without sort of tipping them off to something that would change their behavior or change the results of the experiment. In other words, you let them know as much as you can in a way that won't corrupt your experiment. Unfortunately, if we go back 70 years, informed consent wasn't followed, wasn't required, and ethics review also wasn't required. For example, there were participants who were given syphilis so that the impact and treatments could be tested. So, and specifically, they were given to black men. And so there was a huge racist component to that. And so these people were given a potentially fatal disease infection to test whether or not Oh, they weren't even told that they had the disease. That's pretty shocking. Um, we can see one side like, well, in order to test the effects of syphilis and possible treatments, people need to have it. And so, there, again, there's that trade off, but this would never pass an ethics review board. Um, but it happened anyway. And it didn't happen to, or it only happened to people of color. And so there was a racist component, there was a deception component, and there was a huge ethical violation. So it's kind of like a reminder of things that did happen in the past. There are plenty of stories in the history of psychology that are alarming, to say the least. If you use animal subjects, and some psychologists conduct research on dogs and pigeons and rats, B.F. Skinner was a famous example, um, you don't go to a human ethics review board, you go to the IACUC, or the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, who will review whether or not animals are being harmed or in a way that is greater than the benefits of the research. And yay, I made it to the end. And if you're watching that, you made it to the end too. Um, so as you can see, I think this is way more detailed for an undergraduate psychology textbook, or a first year psychology textbook. But you can see that there are a lot of components to research if you're interested in getting into it. And so you can start at the very basic level where you're starting to learn how to ask questions and collect data and analyze it, all the way to the learning how to design controlled experiments, collecting data and analyzing it using statistics, and then producing outcomes that you can then present or publish, which would be a great four-year goal if you're a first-year college student. To be involved in some sort of psychological research with a mentor, or design something yourself as with undergraduate research.